Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. This is episode number 2 in our series for 2025, and today's date is Friday, February the 14th. First, I'll be talking to Holly Fowler, the founder and CEO of Wable, which is the first of its kind social networking and app for neurodivergent people. It started as a dating app, but it's now just an app to connect with other neurodivergent folks. And I'll be talking to independent economist Saul Eslake about what to expect in the Australian and global economies in 2025 with the predictably unpredictable Trump. But first, let's talk to Holly Fowler.
Well, Holly, tell us about your business. How did you set it up and when?
Yeah, sure. It feels like a long time ago now, but first sort of came up with the idea of Wable all the way back in 2020, and I can't remember what lockdown number it was. It might have been 5 or 6, but as you know, in Melbourne there were many of them and lots of time. I think for a lot of people, as frustrating as it was, I think allowed maybe more time and space to think about the important things in life and how important connection is for everyone. There was lots of thoughts that I was having, and I watched the ABC hit series Love on the Spectrum that has just come out with another season over in the States. But I fell in love with the show, and I thought, why isn't there something like this to connect the neurodivergent community for friends and dates, but for other resources as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But and then Wable came about.
So basically it's working with people, neurodivergent people, or as I would put it, people on the spectrum.
Yeah, so it's working with neurodivergent people, which captures, people on the spectrum, people with autism. And and that was the real reason for creating something like this. There's lots of social networking and perhaps dating apps out there that you probably know of. But as far as a community for neurodivergent people to connect with the resources that we have, I think, we were doing something that was really needed, and probably we're receiving feedback now that a lot of people were really waiting for.
So you would have required a lot of investment in your business. Would that be right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it started just as myself. I came up with the idea and started sort of building out what that prototype looked like with savings. But, I'm 25 and savings could only sort of get me so far when starting out business. And I, hadn't done anything like this before. So I quickly needed to, get investment, get a team around me that, shared the same vision as I did, which, I'm really lucky now that we've got a board of 4 and more staff outside of that board, which has been, instrumental to our growth and success as we've just launched just over a month ago. Yeah.
So, this would have taken you nearly 4 years.
Yeah, I came up with the idea in 2020, and then, I was building what the prototype would look like in the middle of the night and refining sort of the idea and what I wanted Wable to look like. But that was, in the middle of the night and off the side of my desk of my day job, because, I didn't sort of know how to get from where to go. I had this idea, which I thought was really needed. But it took a long time to build out what that would look like, a prototype of the app. But I also needed to make sure, I had funds behind me to, all well and good to have the idea, but how do you get it to people? How do you tell your story? But also to get the right team in place so that when we got to launch and people were using it, there was the right resourcing in place to make sure that we could, service the customers on our app. So it took a long time, but it funnily feels like it was just yesterday that I originally came up with the idea. I feel that it's gone super fast, maybe because we've been so busy.
Right, okay, but the actual technology itself, did you do that or did you get help or what?
No, we outsourced the actual app build. So we worked with designers at the start to sort of build out what we wanted the app to look and feel like, but then we had to onboard a development team which we outsourced and that we worked with and we still work with every day almost to make the app function and to build it from what was in my head and on paper into a real app on the App Store, which yeah, it takes a lot of time. And we also had a testing phase where we had a group of people that were willing to trial and test the app before, everyone else got to see it, which was great because we got a really good engaged audience that was so willing to give us feedback and I guess, yeah, be a world first group that got to see and feel what it was like. So yeah, it took time, but I think with these things, we wanted to make sure when we got to launch it, we could get it right.
So you've had feedback from overseas on this?
Yeah, we have. It's been one thing I think that I look back on as definitely one of the best decisions we made. I mentioned Love on the Spectrum before, and one of the main cast members from the Australian season, Michael Theo, was and continues to be instrumental in our success, but also part of, advising us on and his thoughts on Wable, particularly in the beginning phases. So he's really been on the journey for a really long time. But when he started working with us and with the app and promoting it as well, we captured his audiences sort of all over the world because the Love on the Spectrum captured the hearts of lots of people, and the United States in particular had a pretty great audience of people watching the show, and the UK. So naturally we got to launch here in Australia, which was a big feat, but then there were lots of people going and trying to sign up to the app overseas, which we always had expansion plans, but I guess it's made us sort of fast track what that looks like, because we've already got sign up groups overseas that are really excited for when the app is turned on in their country. So we can't wait to get out there.
Now, originally you had conceptualized this, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
as like a dating app, but it's much broader now, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's sort of what I mentioned earlier. When I first came up with the idea, it was very much, I was thinking, oh, there needs to be a dating app. And then when I surrounded myself with the team and lots of people that consulted through what sort of Wable looked like, the initial prototype of Wable, I sometimes go back and look how much it evolved, because I was speaking we've got an in-app psychologist now, and speaking to parents and carers and support care workers, primary carers in the neurodivergent community. It was apparent to me that yes, there are lots of people that are seeking romantic partners, and yes, Wable can be a platform for that. But it can also be a platform for making friends, to connect, even if you're not sure what relationship you're looking for, but you just want to connect with like-minded people who might understand some of the similar challenges that we're going through. I mean, neurodivergent or neurotypical, we all want to feel valued and understood. And I think that made me rethink and I guess broaden the app for what it was offering, because if make it a platform for as many people as possible to find what they're, the connection they're looking for, then why not open it up? But yeah, you're right. In the beginning phases, I was like, really, it needs to be, it's a dating app, but it's evolved to be so much more than that over time. And I think that was a really a great decision that we made early. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the things that really came out in Love on the Spectrum.
Yeah.
Partly it was dating, but a lot of it was just seeking connections with like-minded people who may not be on the spectrum, but who understand it.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so important. And it's interesting, like I had an email from a mum who, her son is on Wable at the moment, and she emailed, it would have been a few weeks ago, and said, like, we're super happy to see that this app is out there. We live in a rural community and my son isn't too keen on getting out and socializing in public, but this platform means that he still has, human connection, and he can connect with people all over the country if he wants to, and to make friends. And I think that, that's really important, because there are lots of people that would look for that sort of connection online. And then there are also people that are really super keen to go on dates and meet friends in person. So yeah, I think hearing that feedback as well, that, people are on it and are creating these connections, it feels amazing, because it's everything we hoped for.
Well, it's also important because there are people who aren't on the spectrum, but some of us tick some of the boxes.
Yeah, I mean,
we can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, neurodivergent or neurotypical, I think we all face we all have our own challenges in life, and we really built Wable for the neurodivergent community. But of course, there are lots of people that would love to meet, somebody and on the spectrum who might understand some of their challenges as well. So I think, we really tailored the Wable community for neurodivergent people to connect. But, I'm sure that lots of people would would find that really useful.
So where do you see this going over the next few years?
Yeah, over the next few years, well, I think it's fast tracked a lot, probably quicker than I expected. We got to launch here in Australia, which was super exciting, and yeah, we were certainly always expecting that this thing would click and people would be really keen to join it. But I think expansion plans will be fast tracked. So we're looking to launch next in the UK, US, and New Zealand over the next couple of months. So that'll be super exciting. It's actually quite easy to turn the app on, for example, overseas and make it downloadable. But from a business perspective of everything else that comes with it, we want to make sure that when that happens, we have, more members of the team to help make sure that we've got the support in place where we need it, because the more people on the app, the more work that creates, which is awesome. So it's allowing us, we're in a period now where we're preparing for that growth. But yeah, we can't wait to launch US, UK, and New Zealand next. And then the sky's the limit after that. We got signups the other day from Tanzania. So it's pretty amazing to see how far we've traveled in a short amount of time. So yeah, the next 6 months will be massive to see where that takes us. But yeah, really the sky's the limit, and our team is really excited for a long journey, and to see how many lives that this will touch. And we definitely would like to continue expanding after that as well.
Well, Holly, it's been great talking to you, and thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you for having me. It's lovely to meet you.
And now let's talk to independent economist Saul Eslake.
Now, Saul, how do you see the situation with inflation and interest rates in Australia for a start?
It's improving. In a word, the most recent CPI data tell us that the underlying inflation rate over the year to the December quarter, that's the one that the Reserve Bank watches, not the so-called headline rate that has been massaged by federal and state government energy bill relief and other measures. But the underlying annual inflation rate has come down to 3.2% over the year to the December quarter. That's 0.2 of a percentage point lower than the Reserve Bank had expected it to be. It's well down on the 6.8% peak that we had in late 2022. And I'd argue that it's close enough to the top end of the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target band to give the board the confidence it has previously said it needs, that inflation is sustainably headed back towards the target range, that it can start to cut interest rates at its next meeting on the 17th and 18th of February. Now, in the December quarter, it wasn't in the target, but I'd make 2 points about that. First, the monthly CPI data, which admittedly isn't as comprehensive as the quarterly numbers, showed that over the 12 months to the month of December, the annual underlying inflation rate was 2.7%. In other words, it was in the target rate. But more importantly, we know, and the Reserve Bank knows, that monetary policy acts with a lag. So they have to make their decisions about interest rates not based on what's happened over the last 12 months, but what they reasonably expect to happen over the next 6 to 18 months. And as I say, I think they've got good reason to believe that as we're speaking now, getting close to the middle of the March quarter of 2025, underlying inflation is back within the target range. And if they waited until underlying inflation was, say, 2.5% before doing anything, almost certainly they'd end up undershooting the inflation target, as they did for 5 years between 2016 and 2020, and potentially risking unnecessarily high unemployment.
Now, the question is, okay, if we have a rate cut in February, can we expect the same in April?
History would say yes, that we would expect another rate cut in either April or May, and possibly, depending on what the data tell us about how far underlying inflation is falling, another one in, say, July or August. But I'd have to say that the prospect for further rate reductions after that is more limited for 3 reasons. One, because the Reserve Bank of Australia never put interest rates up by as much as its peers in the US, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand did. And all of those central banks have cut their interest rates at least 3 times, but they have further to bring them down, having put them up by more than Australia did. Second, fiscal policy is turning more expansionary in Australia now as the budget moves into deficit after 2 consecutive surpluses. And third, it's likely that the tariff policies now being implemented by the Trump administration And the increases in the budget deficit that will result from Trump's proposed tax policies will put upward pressure not just on inflation in the US, but globally, which could also limit the scope for further reductions in Australian inflation and interest rates.
That said, it would also put pressure on the Fed to, well, maybe either keep rates on hold or maybe even raise them.
Well, yes, and indeed the Fed has, at its last two meetings, downplayed the prospects of further significant reductions in US interest rates. In September last year, the Fed was foreshadowing that there'd be 4 rate cuts in 2025. In December last year, after the election, when they last cut interest rates by 25 basis points, they dialed back that forecast to being only 2 rate reductions in 2025. Now, President Trump has been quite aggressive, as he normally is, in denouncing Jerome Powell and the Fed for not knowing as much about interest rates as he does and for not cutting interest rates. But in his own way, Powell has pushed back on that, not by making any comments about anything the administration has done or proposed to do, but just quietly asserting the Fed's independence. And although Donald Trump might like to stack the Federal Reserve Board in the same way that he stacked the Supreme Court during his first administration, the reality is that there is only one vacancy on the Federal Reserve Board currently coming up during his term of office. Jay Powell's term as chair expires in May of next year, which gives him another 15 or so months before he can be replaced as chair. But Powell could choose to stay on for the balance of his term as a Fed governor, which doesn't expire until sometime in 2030.
And the impact on US inflation could be quite severe, and particularly on the US car industry and groceries.
Well, yes. I mean, this is what tariffs do. Tariffs are not something, as Trump seems to imagine, that you make foreigners pay to get their goods into your country. They're something that a government makes its own consumers pay to keep foreign goods out of a country. And the 25% tariffs that Trump has announced will be imposed on imports from Canada and Mexico, and the additional 10% tariffs on top of the 25% tariffs that were imposed on imports from China during Trump's first administration, and which were kept in place by the Biden administration and in some cases increased further. Those additional tariffs on imports from China will be paid by Americans, not by Chinese, not by Canadians, not by Mexicans, and they'll predominantly be paid by lower income Americans who are much more likely to buy stuff imported, particularly from China, than the tech bros who bankrolled Trump's campaign, who typically don't buy Chinese cars, who buy BMWs and Mercedes and Porsches and Lamborghinis and Ferraris, which are all imported from Europe. Now, there may well be additional tariffs on imports from Europe. I wouldn't be surprised if there were. And the results of that will be inflationary. The results of the retaliation that countries hit by US tariffs will probably be inflationary as well. I think it's pretty stupid of the Canadian to be responding to the tariffs Trump has imposed on them by saying, well, if the American government wants to force Americans to pay more for goods imported into America from Canada, we're going to make Canadians pay more for goods imported into Canada from the United States. That's circular firing squad stuff, but nonetheless, they're doing it. A far more effective form of retaliation by Canada, in my view, would be to cut off the supply of oil and gas from Alberta to the US, to cut off the supply of hydroelectricity from Quebec and Labrador to New York and other cities in the Northeast, and maybe as a symbolic gesture, to cut off the supply of maple syrup that Americans put on their toast at breakfast time or on their waffles. And Canada could afford to compensate the producers of those items because its level of public debt is only about 15% of GDP. So they could do that. That would be far more effective. It would be imposing pain on Americans who voted for Donald Trump without imposing any pain on Canadians. But instead, they've chosen to do something stupid. I hope if it turns out that Trump imposes tariffs on imports from Australia as well, which he might, that we wouldn't be as stupid as the Canadians have been in the way we respond.
Well, Trump has been predictably unpredictable, and so we don't know whether these might be reversed if the share market responds, and as he did with Colombia, for example.
Well, possibly, although the tariffs that were threatened to Colombia were designed to get Colombia to accept deportations of its citizens from the United States, whereas the tariffs Trump has imposed on Canada and Mexico, it would seem not merely designed to get those countries to do more to curb the import or the transmission of fentanyl into the United States, of which very little actually crosses the border between Canada and the United States. Most of it crosses the border between Mexico and the United States, yet Canada has been thumped with the same tariffs that Trump has imposed on Mexico. The one thing that is predictable about Trump is that he will do, or he will attempt to do, what he has said he will do. That's something that Trump supporters like about him. He likes to say promises made, promises kept. And so all the things he has said he will do, he will probably try to do. And given that the Republicans hold majorities in both houses of Congress, and that most of the Republicans, notwithstanding what they might privately believe, seem prone to do whatever Trump tells them to do, he'll probably be able to get a lot of what he wants done. The problem for those trying to work out what all this means is that the consequences of Trump doing what he says are often very different from what he has said the consequences of doing what he says will be.
Indeed, and these tariffs are all part of a general expansion plan of the US, like taking over Greenland, taking over the Panama Canal, etc.
Well, yes, and it remains to be seen how that plays out. Trump could use tariffs as a weapon to browbeat Denmark into conceding control of Greenland to the United States, although given that Denmark is a member of the EU, that would entail an economic fight between the US and the EU, which is almost as big as the United States, in fact, has a bigger population than the United States, rather than just with tiny little Denmark. But more broadly, it kind of makes you wonder, if Vladimir Putin had started his inaugural speech by saying that Russia wanted to take over Greenland, or that it wanted to get Alaska back, having sold it to the United States in 1857, or whenever it was, 1867, the world would be outraged. But somehow the world has so far been amazingly supine in the face of Trump's really quite aggressive words towards what are supposed to be American allies.
Well, it'll be fascinating to watch, Saul. And thank you so much for your time again.
That's a pleasure as always.
So what's happening in the news? Well, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has had an urgent discussion with US President Donald Trump as he signalled plans for sweeping 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium imports. Mr Albanese told the House his government would continue to make the case for a carve-out from those tariffs. I presented Australia's case for an exemption, and we agreed on wording to say publicly, which is that the US President agreed that an exemption was under consideration in the interests of both our countries, Albanese said. It was his first conversation with Mr Trump since a brief phone call offering his congratulations upon the US President's election. The federal government is already facing pressure to ensure Australia is exempted from the tariffs in a repeat of diplomatic efforts achieved in 2018. Back then, Australia, with countries like Canada, Mexico and the UK, was carved out of new tariffs placed on steel and aluminium imports to the US. The meeting with Trump, which was penciled in as a courtesy chat, coincides with industry and business groups warning that the tariffs will result in job losses and a manufacturing downturn. On the other hand, Australia's almond, wine and beef producers will be unlikely winners from aggressive US tariffs, thanks to advantageous trade deals with major export partners like China and India, underpinning demand for the country's cheaper commodities. The US doesn't have any such agreements in place, and the cheaper Australian dollar, thanks to Trump's policies boosting the greenback, has helped. So it's a two-finger salute to Trump from our rural industries. And so far, Elon Musk's Doge team has cut more than $1 billion into spending in the first 3 weeks. More than half of those cost savings that Doge says it has found are related to diversity, equity and inclusion. That's a mere fraction of the $2 trillion in spending Musk has targeted, but this could soon change markedly as Doge team members are now embedding in some of the government's largest programs, particularly those focused on healthcare. For example, Musk and his team of Muskrats, as they're dubbed in Washington group recently, gained access to Medicare and Medicaid's contracting and payment system, where they say they're looking for evidence of fraud. Trump on Friday said Musk will also look at the education department and at military too. Doge was also involved in cutting National Institutes of Health grant money for overhead. Scientists quickly decried the cuts. They say all this would devastate important medical research. The agency estimated the cuts announced Friday night would save $4 billion a year by capping at 15% the fees that universities and institutions get to pay for lab support services, rather than individually negotiated rates that can exceed 60%. If the priority had been to actually cut waste and fraud in federal spending, they're not looking in the right places, because the costs of the federal workforce are a fraction of the federal budget, said Danielle Bryan, Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight, an independent government watchdog. Doge, which as currently designed is an entity in the White House, is supposed to present its recommendations to taxpayers on the 4th of July 2026. Musk and the group are moving much more quickly, though, to try to cancel contracts and even direct changes in congressional approval. Elon Musk's ultimate goal is a dramatically smaller and weaker government, as he and a coterie of aides move to control, automate and substantially diminish hundreds if not thousands of public functions and jobs. In less than 3 weeks, Musk's US Doge service has allowed the same playbook at one federal agency after another: install loyalists in leadership, hoover up internal data, including the sensitive and classified, gain control of the flow of funds, and they're pushing hard, by means that are legal or otherwise, to eliminate jobs and programs not ideologically aligned with Trump administration goals. The Doge campaign has generated chaos on a near-hourly basis across the nation's capital, but it appears carefully choreographed in service of a broader agenda to gut the civilian workforce, assert power over the vast federal bureaucracy, and shrink it to levels unseen in at least 20 years. The aim is a diminished government that exerts less oversight over private business, delivers fewer services and comprises a smaller share of the US economy, but is far more responsive to the directives of the President. All this has caused concern in the courts. Late Friday, a federal judge in Washington declined to block Doge access to Labor Department data. The judge expressed concern about these young Doge staffers who've never had any training with respect to the handling of confidential information, accessing the medical and financial records of millions of Americans. And on Saturday, a federal judge in New York temporarily blocked Doge staff